Hi, it's Tim Grant.
And Nicci McLeod from the Writing Wrongs podcast.
This episode may contain descriptions of domestic violence, child harm, murder, and discussions of illegal abortion and the death penalty.
In this episode, we'll be interviewing Kate Summerscale about her book, The Peepshow, The Murders at 10 Rillington Place.
We hope you enjoy the show.
Writing Wrongs, an original podcast series from the Aston Institute for Forensic Linguistics, Series 1, bonus episode, Kate Summerscale on her book, The Peepshow, The Murders at 10 Rillington Place.
Hello and welcome to Writing Wrongs, the podcast from AIFL, the Aston Institute for Forensic Linguistics at Aston University. Here we're all about improving the delivery of justice through the analysis of language. I'm Dr. Nicci McLeod, Deputy Director of AIFL.
And I'm Professor Tim Grant.
In our last episode, we examined the Timothy Evans case and how forensic linguistics was born through an analysis of his statements. Just as a reminder, a bit of a recap, Evans was accused of the murder of his wife Beryl and of his baby Geraldine. He was convicted of Geraldine's murder and he was executed. But it was established sometime later that his downstairs neighbour Christie was a serial killer. He was found to have murdered at least 6 other women at the same address. So as a result of concern that Timothy Evans had been wrongly hanged, a forensic linguist, or what we would now term a forensic linguist, Jan Svartvik, was asked to perform an analysis, a linguistic analysis of Evans' statements that he had made to the police, including the confession that incriminated him. So for evidence to a public inquiry, Jan Svartvik, he concluded with this report that there were definite style shifts between the incriminating parts of Timothy Evans' confession statements and the non-incriminating parts and the other statements that he'd made to police. So the reason we included this story was that it's a really important part of the kind of origins story of forensic linguistics. It was the first time that the term forensic linguistics had actually been published at all. That's what he used to publish his report after the inquiry. He called it The Evans Statement, a Case for Forensic Linguistics.
So yes, and that was the last episode. And in this bonus episode, we're following up that discussion with our very first guest interview on the podcast. And we're delighted to be welcoming author and historian Kate Summerscale to join us. Kate started out as a journalist and was literary editor of the Daily Telegraph before turning to writing books full-time. She has won numerous prizes for her books, which blend meticulous and detailed history, often of significant crimes. The first book of hers that I read was The Suspicions of Mr. Witcher, and I've read several books since, including The Peepshow, The Murder at 10 Rillington Place. The Suspicions of Mr. Witcher is an account of an infamous Victorian murder case and the invention of the modern detective. And this book won many plaudits, including the Samuel Johnson Prize for Non-Fiction.
As you mentioned, Kate's latest book, The Peepshow, The Murders at 10 Rillington Place, this focuses on those notorious crimes of John Reginald Christie, also on the kind of newspaper reporting of the time that kind of sensationalised the murders and that kind of thing. So the book explores the lives of Christie's victims, creates a very vivid and sordid picture of 1950s London. Obviously, this is a world where young women could struggle really to kind of find any sort of financial independence without implicitly or explicitly selling sex. The lack of legal abortion, which obviously put a lot of pressure and led to many young women who found themselves with unwanted pregnancies into a bit of a disaster really, and vulnerable at the hands of people like John Christie. These women would become prey for predatory men like Reg Christie, as we hear in the book.
As well as telling the story of Christie's murders and the investigations and prosecutions that eventually follow, Kate also tells the story of Timothy Evans and how Evans and his wife Beryl and daughter Geraldine became tragically caught up in Christie's murders. We're delighted to welcome Kate to Writing Wrongs as our very first guest, and I'm enormously pleased and excited to discuss her understanding of the events at 10 Rillington Place, and also to hear her views about Timothy Evans and the statements which were analysed by Svartvik. So welcome, Kate.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
I'll get started, if that's all right, and just ask, how did this idea come about? How did you get interested in the Rillington Place murders? Obviously, they have a significant place in sort of the history of crime and the history of capital punishment and so on in this country. And I just wondered what motivated you really to start here.
Looking back, I think that the reason I got interested at that particular moment, which was about 4 years ago, is that there were the murders taking place. It was during the COVID pandemic, and there were murders taking place of women in London by strangers, such as the Sarah Everard case, who was abducted and murdered by Wayne Couzens, and also 2 sisters who were killed in a park in North London near where I live. And the man who killed them said that he had intended to kill 6 women in 6 months. And I just thought, what is it with these men who target women who are strangers to them? So it's not motivated by personal animus, but something more abstract and generalised. And I thought of Christie. I couldn't even remember his name, but I knew the address, 10 Rillington Place. I'd seen the film sometime in my teens on late night TV. I'd seen his statue at Madame Tussauds as a child. And so I became curious about him as this sort of seminal serial killer of women post-war.
On the last podcast, which you've heard, we talked through the case, and we talked about the position of this case in terms of the abolition of the death penalty, for example, how sort of significant a part it had to play in that. Was that something that you kind of considered when you were sort of thinking about the planning of this book?
And I was curious about its status as a case that had sort of changed the structure of British law and that had such a big mystery at its heart. The mystery of who killed Beryl and Geraldine Evans is still contested. It's still up for discussion. So that was intriguing. Even though it didn't pull me to it to begin with, it made it seem like it might be a richer story. And indeed, I got completely sucked into to the puzzle of the Evans case and all its contradictions, and just, as wanting to know what really happened.
What happened? Yeah. So where did you start?
Well, I went to the National Archives at Kew, and there's an incredible wealth of material there on these 2 cases, almost overwhelming. There are huge fat police files, also Home Office files, prison files on both men, Timothy Evans and John Christie. And there's lots of material in there that hasn't really been used because it's not directly pertinent to the Evans case, but is more just about the lives of Christie's neighbours, the women he murdered, the families of the women he murdered, tradesmen who called at the house. And so it immediately felt a very kind of rich resource for just painting that moment in time. And I was very interested in not only Christie's personal history and his psychology, but the social history, the culture he was in, and how his crimes connected to that culture. So by painting a sort of broader canvas of the people involved, I hope I would get at something of that place and time.
Yeah, that struck me a lot in the book as well. And one of the themes you really seem to delve into is the role of the press in the case, and this sort of, very definitely sensationalist approach, and how the press interfere in the case. Do you want to tell us a bit why you were interested in that, or what was the lead into that theme in the book? Because it's really strong there, I think.
And I suppose sort of personally, I've worked in newspapers, what's sort of sometimes still called Fleet Street, even though it's no longer there. And so there is this kind of history of my trade, as it were, that's there. And also I was aware that people reporting on the case were in a way my predecessors as the observers, the writers, deciding how to tell this story, what to focus on, what to believe. And I took as one of my central figures through whose eyes I tried to see the investigation unfolding, this man called Harry Proctor, who was a star crime reporter for a tabloid paper, who went after this case like a terrier, just determined to get the scoop, to get the exclusive. And he was motivated. I mean, it was an absolutely feral time in Fleet Street, extremely competitive, a lot of money the newspapers were making. Everyone read the papers. So it was competitive, rivalrous, and he was very ambitious. But he was also motivated by a sense of guilt and shame because he had interviewed Christie at the time that the Evans murders were discovered and had taken all his statements at face value, not thought to suspect him. So when he was revealed as a serial killer, Harry Proctor wanted to, in a way, atone for his mistake and to get the truth and get justice.
That's really interesting, isn't it? Because in the history that you tell, and we touched on in our podcast, the Evans murder case, the death of Beryl and Geraldine, were a couple of years previously. And so you have the police crawling over the house, and you have the press around at the house. Although I think you do comment, it's not a very high-profile story. It's sort of just another domestic murder or something like that. And both the press and the police missed this fact that there were visible human remains in the back garden, and there were other hotels. So it's interesting that you see Harry Proctor as being motivated by guilt for missing that. And I don't think, unless you found it in your research, I don't think there's evidence that the police felt the same way.
Not that I came across, no. There was just the peculiar coincidence of Harry Proctor having been there, turning up at the house when the bodies were discovered in 1953, and realising he'd been inside that house interviewing the man that the police were now seeking. But yes, I'm sure there were feelings among the police too of unease about what had happened, and a sort of discomfort. Reg Christie had been a policeman during the war, so he was sort of one of theirs.
Absolutely.
And this may have led them to overlook the possibility that he was guilty in the when the bodies in the Evans case were discovered.
I think that's interesting, and obviously also then maybe another parallel with the Sarah Everard,
right,
where the guilty man used his power as a police officer. I'm not so sure that's true of Christie, but
I think when Christie's first murders, he definitely, he was in uniform. He had a position of authority and trust. It would have been all the easier for him to cover his tracks, to lure women back to his house, to get them to talk to him in cafes and so on.
So this was about a decade, not quite a decade, before Beryl Evans and Geraldine Evans were killed, early 1940s during the war, when Christie was a volunteer police officer or a temporary police officer, reserve police officer, but he had the uniform and may not
all the powers. Yes, he had all the authority of the police.
That's really interesting. So back to these tellings by the press a little bit. We've had quite a lot of discussions about starting the podcast and the sort of temptations of sensationalism and exploitation. I was wondering whether, given the current wave of true crime genres, both in podcasts and all sorts of books, do you think there's a sort of a basic need for these sensationalist tellings? And what about your own work? You've said in terms of the book itself, you felt that you linked back to the previous tellings of the journalist. What are your thoughts as someone who often touches on historical crimes and so on?
I called the book The Peepshow partly as a sort of nod towards the fact that you can't ever tell these stories and be entirely free of that sort of exploitative thrill of kind of of getting a story from the suffering of other people. And so I think there will always be something a little bit uneasy in this genre. And I used the examples of the contemporary sort of journalists and writers as a way of kind of helping me to keep reflecting on what I was doing and why.
Yes. Yeah, absolutely.
And so I think two things. One is to acknowledge the lure of this dark material for some people, including me, many people, I think. Yeah. And especially women, oddly enough, who outnumber men 2-1 in their consumption of true crime podcasts.
Nicci has commented on this with MacLeod's Murder Tours.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. I mean, it was so back in the sort of the earlier episode that we did about this case, I kind of talked about how it does seem to be a very sort of female thing. There's this fascination amongst that particular demographic. I actually heard my favourite comedian say on stage a few weeks back, she said that, okay, who's into true crime? And all these female voices say, yeah. She said, right, so all the women are into true crime because the men are all out there doing it.
Well, I'm sure there's something there, actually, not that all the men are into but that it is one among many motivations for reading about or thinking about listening to these stories is to sort of understand in order to sort of protect yourself emotionally or literally sometimes, like what are the tricks, however. So that's perhaps part of it, but I don't think it's all of it. So I think it's important to me, and it has been in writing other true crime stories, to acknowledge that and that sort of raw, pull to this material, but also to sort of think about the ways in which you're presenting things and for what purpose, and to remember all the time that it's true and that these were real people. And in many cases might have living relatives, as I found there were in this case. But even if there aren't living relatives, even if you're writing about a Victorian murder, to write about them as if they were living relatives, the fact that they're long dead doesn't mean that they don't deserve your sort of respect.
That's very pertinent to us, I guess, because we are, in the previous podcast, we were looking at the historic case, which at least has that little bit of distance in time, but we're also going to be looking at contemporary cases, and we very much feel that, that sort of respect for the victims and their families has to be part of how we approach this in our work.
Something to be very aware of all the time, isn't it?
And much as you like to imagine with linguistics, you're sort of fascinated by the language as well as, the material, the stories associated with it. For me, writing about it's such a fantastic way of getting material on ordinary lives in the past, which is hard to come by. But in the police records, in witness statements to especially a very big crime where an immense amount of evidence was gathered and lots of testimony taken, you get so many details about how people lived, what cigarettes they smoked, and what they ordered at the cafe, and the language in which they chatted to their neighbours. And I love all that. So it's not just a lurid kind of pull, it's also the sort of texture of the times that you can get at.
That's definitely true of our work as well. So my interest in what we would formerly call sub-varieties of English, but say street slangs, is much deeper, but I've been drawn into that through the casework we do in those areas. So that's interesting.
As we've already touched on, there's a clear feminist ethos behind this book. Obviously, we've got this sort of tale as old as time of the serial killer, and I think this is probably the case for kind of 90% of serial killers, is that we've got someone with a very deep-seated misogyny, a very deep hatred of women, caused, in this case, and by lots of others that I've read about, by the fact that once a woman laughed at him.
There's a saying, isn't there, about like the worst thing a man has to fear of a woman is being laughed at. The worst thing a woman has to fear of a man is that he can kill her with his bare hands. It's kind of not a really equitable situation there. And apart from that, we've also got this kind of whole backdrop of the fact that we've got these women who were vulnerable as a result of the social situation, the fact that the abortion was illegal, the fact that they had no chance for sort of financial independence. That's what made them vulnerable. We've got I'm just going to read a little extract here about something that Christie had actually said about women. They dress up and paint up and give you the come on, and you can't help thinking they wouldn't look nearly so cheeky nor so saucy if they were helpless and dead. So we've got that kind of, I guess, on a personal level misogyny of this one particular viral individual, and then we've got this kind of broader social situation for women. You focus a lot on the victim stories, and I just wondered if you could say maybe a few words about what the importance is of giving those stories life and basically providing those details about those women.
At the time, the women were sort of treated as a group with pity. They were dismissed, though, as poor little tarts, and one writer whose story I cover described them as murderees, almost bound to their lives to end in violence. And so I was curious about what I could find out about their stories, and there was quite a lot in the police files that was not used at the time. And in the last podcast, Tim, you referred to the fact that British courts only tried one murder at a time. Yeah. This also meant that the murderer of all these women, even everyone knew who it was, Christie, he was never convicted of their murders, and their stories never came out in court. So there was really a minimal amount of information about them made public. So then they ranged wildly in their backgrounds, their aspirations, their personalities, I found. So there was one, for example, his first victim, Ruth First, was a refugee, a Jewish refugee from Austria, who had aspired to become a nurse, but was locked up as an enemy alien during the war and had to give up on that ambition. And another, Kay Maloney, was a sex worker who was essentially homeless and sleeping in a lavatory on the Edgware Road, and would do anything for a drink. I was much loved by her friends, who were very protective towards her. So nearly all of the women had illegitimate children. Nearly all of them were pregnant or thought to be pregnant at the times of their death, which makes me think that Christie may have got many of them home and got them to submit to his gassing device, his homemade gassing device, by promising them an abortion. But there were other ways he got women back, by the promise of a glass of brandy or a modelling session or a bed for the night, pair of silk stockings. They were all desperate, and it was extremely hard for a single woman in London to manage at all. Women were routinely paid less than men. And he preyed on this. And most of the women he targeted were newcomers to the city who would have few friends or family to notice that they'd gone missing or to come looking for them.
Yeah, and also within that, I think I can't remember which woman it was, but one of them lost their job through their pregnancy. So that showed the structural vulnerability of being a young woman in that situation who got pregnant,
Yes.
loses their job, and then where else do they go other than maybe to sell sex directly or indirectly to find someone who will keep them and so on.
Yes, she was even working in the kitchen, the lion's corner.
Yes.
But the fact she was showing was thought so sort of inappropriate, that she was fired. I think two of them were fired for being pregnant. Yeah.
So again, that sort of no other option. Abortion's illegal. You lose your job if you get pregnant. How are you going to live in that situation? It's just appalling choices.
Unresolvable sort of position, isn't it?
So, as we've touched on already, another strong theme in the book is around the politics of abolishing the death penalty. And you indicate the different views of the Conservative government, followed by the Labour government, where the Conservative government were keen to preserve the death penalty as a article of policy, and some of their actions you interpret as sort of upholding that, I guess, of being concerned that if there had been shown to be a miscarriage of justice or something, then that would give weight to the other side, the Labour Party view that the death penalty ought to be sort of abolished. I guess there's a strong version of that concern, which is that the government couldn't allow Christie to confess to the crimes for which Evans had been convicted and hanged. Do you sort of see that as the government complicity or the institutional British establishment complicity in that for want of keeping up the death penalty? The politics is interesting to me.
Yeah, I hadn't anticipated it when I started on the book, but it did turn into quite a political story at times. I think, yes, it was to preserve the reputation of the British justice system. Yeah. That was part of it. And also to preserve the integrity of the death penalty as a deterrent. And this was a very feverish time in a way because there was a huge amount of violence in London after the war, including gun violence with all the guns that had been sort of left over. And so even people who opposed the death penalty were like, oh, maybe not abolish it yet, in 1950s. And so the government, when the Christie case came to trial, I think it's significant that they asked the Attorney General to prosecute Christie. It was a very political move in itself.
That's interesting. I hadn't picked that up. Yeah.
So he was, a government man, and he was eager throughout the trial to suppress any mentions of the Evans case or attribute any significance to it, to insist, no, we're just trying Christie here for the murder of his wife, and he is not admitted to the murder of the baby Geraldine Evans. Whereas the defence were trying to introduce the Evans case wherever they could because they thought it would support their argument that Christie was insane if he'd been, murdered her and the baby. So there was a very strong political undercurrents then and afterwards when there was a government inquiry set up, but the government made it private into the Evans case. And they said, oh, no, there's nothing to see here. It was all above board and he was definitely guilty. And as I discovered, they also actively suppressed a memo detailing a confession that Christie made to a prison guard, which would have opened up the whole, can of worms about the Evans case, because for the first time Christie confessed to killing Geraldine Evans and hinted, well, not just hinted, he sort of implied why it had been done. And that document was not made available to the public or the press.
Yes, until some time later, not sort of a few years later, in sort of the historical release period, wasn't it?
Yes, exactly. 1993.
Yeah.
The two inquiries, the private and public inquiries into the Evans case, did have sight of it, but it was not released more widely.
So speaking of the inquiries, I find the second inquiry, so the first inquiry was between Christie's conviction and then his execution. That was the Henderson inquiry. The second inquiry was the Brabin inquiry, which was set up by the Labour government. So again, you've got that political element maybe, and was a public inquiry. And certainly the portrayal you give it is very large, very thorough, and so on. And he comes to this somewhat sort of extraordinary conclusion, which I kept on getting stuck on whenever I go back to. I think so. Kate, would you like to just give us a little reading, a flavour of the book, maybe for the bit where we hear about Brabin's conclusions?
Brabin concluded, to the surprise of many involved in the inquiry, that it was more probable than not that Tim Evans had beaten and strangled Beryl on 8th of November 1949, that Christie had helped him to conceal the corpse, perhaps because he did not want a police investigation that might uncover the bodies in the garden, and that Christie then killed the baby. In effect, Brabin argued that Tim Evans had been hanged for the wrong murder. Since Evans had been convicted of Geraldine's killing, the Queen granted him a posthumous free pardon in October 1966.
So Evans had been convicted of killing his baby, Geraldine, and in our podcast and in your book, you point out that this is the only go for one murder at a time rule, but was never convicted of killing Beryl. But Brabin finds that he probably killed Beryl, but not Geraldine. Can you make sense of that for us?
It seems amazing conclusion to reach after all these months and like millions of, words and testimony. Well, I met a man, a lawyer, a barrister, who was on that, was one of the lawyers at the inquiry. And he said to me that all the lawyers who had been presenting evidence to Brabin, that was the way the inquiry was conducted, they kind of made different cases and called witnesses and then the other lawyers would interrogate those cases and point out the flaws in them. And they were astonished because this argument that Tim Evans killed Beryl and Christie killed Geraldine had never been raised. No one had said that. And so Brabin had just gone off and come up with it. His explanation is that he believed that Tim Evans was a violent man who might have beaten up his wife and sort of ended up killing her. But he couldn't believe that he was a cold-blooded killer who would have killed his baby, whereas Christie was clearly a cold-blooded killer who had no compunction about taking life. So that was his rationale. I think that kind of emotionally, psychologically, what that verdict, Brabin's conclusion does is sort of say, Timothy Evans probably deserves a pardon, but he's a pretty nasty piece of work and he was somehow mixed up in this thing and I can't quite put my finger on how.
That's interesting in terms of the political bit that we were just talking about in a sense. So he sort of, I guess you're saying for motives outside of the inquiry, he wanted to find a means of pardoning.
And for just the emotional impact of the whole inquiry, he both sort of he sort of thought he deserved a pardon, but not a whole one.
Yes.
That kind of fizzling of and the complicity, the sort of half,
Such a strange conclusion though, isn't it? It's almost incomprehensible.
Yeah, really. Obviously, in our last podcast, we talked about our interest in this as forensic linguists is about Evans's statements. This is where questions have been raised about how they were arrived at, how they were composed, and so on. Obviously, we've got as a reminder, we've got the 4 statements, 2 made at Merthyr Tydfil, 2 made in Notting Hill, with quite different stories being presented in each of them. You can see from the book that you've looked at these as part of your research. What would have gone into collecting those during this period by the police?
Well, it was interesting to hear your account of how the statements were taken. I'd sort of gathered something along those lines, but I hadn't read explicitly, what the methodology was. And I'd certainly gathered from the statements taken in Notting Hill, because the policeman who took them down, called Black, was asked about it repeatedly. But he had written down a sort of abbreviated version as he sat there while Evans was talking. I did wonder, in the first place, how written up these were afterwards. I mean, importantly, Tim Evans never said that the police had put words in his mouth. But then, given that he was illiterate and wasn't able to read the statements, I think clearly he had made a confession. But it was fascinating to hear your discussion and Svartik's thing about the particular bits of the statement he made that were out of his normal register, being observed in Merthyr Tydfil, and then at the beginning even of this statement. It did suggest more tampering. I would say sort of gingering up rather than a straightforward corruption, the police wrote it all. And maybe tightening up. Maybe it was in good faith, because some of it, all the thens, he probably didn't say then at all. He probably just said, I did this, and they inserted things that would make the chronology clearer, because that would make better evidence.
Yeah, this is a possibility we discussed, isn't it? The idea that, and we still sort of see this in police interviews today, that despite all the guidance that you should use the interviewee's own words and so on, sometimes that's just not appropriate for producing a statement, or it's not necessarily the best way of kind of putting the story across in a way that's going to make sure this case proceeds through the process, and that there are certain things that an interviewee isn't going to volunteer off their own back.
I, in the past, have, a long time ago now, used to train junior police officers in statement-taking practices. And one of the things that the person I was training alongside, the sort of the police trainer who had been a policeman, would say is, you've got to hit the points to prove. So you know the law. So in the law of, say, rape, there's identity and consent and the actual sexual act. Yeah, those are the points to prove. And what he said is, the witness telling you about it won't know the points to prove. So you've got to structure the statement to hit the points to prove.
Right.
And I think we're aware of this when judging statements that might be good but have lots of police language in. Why is it there, and what's the refinement, I guess?
Yeah, so I guess that's potential explanation for this very different register, very different use of language. A police officer attempting to turn this into something that's of use, basically, and to translate Evans's kind of lay, ordinary language into something that's actually going to be a useful product.
And I noticed in that incriminating bit where he keeps saying, I then did this, I then did that. For example, he says something like, I hit her, his wife, with the flat of my hand. And you're like, he never said that. He said, I hit her.
Yeah.
And the policeman said, how did you hit her? And then he filled it in. So and that's a very, it's quite a sort of grey area. It's not what he would have said. It's not his spontaneous words as they allege, but they may in good faith have just been trying to see, so does this marry up with the injuries she received? So they need to know how he hit her. And then he says, she hit me back. I wondered if he would have even said back, that they need to establish who hit first and all this kind of thing. So I guess that is still a dodgy statement, because they have played with it, even if their motive was to just strengthen it for legal purposes rather than to stitch him up.
Exactly. The motive it isn't really the issue, is it? It's the tampering, as you say.
I don't know. I think that if that's what occurred, that it was hitting the points to prove, the providing the specifics, providing the timeline with all the time markers, then is just providing the time markers. I think that I'm happy to say that was the statement-taking practice of the time, and that allows it to be a good statement. Is this argument about what does verbatim mean? Yeah, versus the possibility that those changes in style indicate insertions by the police, incriminating bits that really did for Tim Evans. So I guess there's the two explanations, that the changes of the language of the witness, the defendant, by the police, are a product of the statement-taking practices of the time, and to hit points to prove and make sure it's specific enough and ordered in time enough. Or there's the argument that this is corruption, and Timothy Evans only didn't say precisely what he was said to have said, but also that he never meant it. It was something that was made up by the police. And I don't know how closely the language evidence can distinguish between those two different interpretations.
We can only draw a conclusion that the language is different, and the
Yes.
actual explanation for why that's the case, I suppose, is of course outside of our remit.
Yes.
Yeah.
Although we all believe it.
So, should we say we've got some issues around reliability of the statement? So, should we just put it like that? Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. When you were doing your research and you were looking at the statements and so on, did you ever come across, because obviously it was part of the inquiry, Svartvik's analysis?
No, I didn't. No. Was it maybe after the inquiry?
Yes, it was
but they
published
had-
as a monograph.
Brabin had access to it. Yeah. No, I didn't. And I can't remember if Ludovic Kennedy referred to this kind of thing in his book, maybe not. But he drew on some other things, so psychology, someone, William Sargent, a psychology, some theories of brainwashing, which felt a bit questionable to me at this distance in time. Whereas this stuff seems really interesting. I mean, it's so good to be able to, things that you feel intuitively reading a document about something shifting, to be able to get that as sort of evidence based on the probabilities and the statistics of certain phrases is really good.
It is interesting. So just to touch on that, Svartvik was commissioned by Herbert Wolfe and the Timothy Evans Committee, which was a campaigning committee. Do you want to say a little bit about who Herbert Wolfe was and how that committee formed? Because that's there in the book too.
Well, I think that Ludovic Kennedy was the real sort of mover behind all this campaign for Timothy Evans. And he gathered together various politicians, MPs, newspaper editors, and Harold Evans, for example, was involved in this, who became the editor of the Sunday Times. And they began campaigning to have another inquiry, to have Evans' conviction overturned. They complained that the original inquiry had been way too quick and secretive. And so it was, in effect, their campaign was also a campaign for the abolition of capital punishment. This was one of the key cases that said capital punishment is irreversible. If there's a miscarriage of justice, we can't put it right. And they thought that this had happened in at least two recent cases, Derek Bentley case and Timothy Evans case. Yeah. It was effective once the Labour government came in. They instituted the inquiry, and they also temporarily suspended the death penalty, which was then made permanent 5 years later.
So it was part of that campaign, and I don't think Svartvik is mentioned in the Kennedy book, but I did reread it, but I have to say I skimmed it rather than read it word by word. But I kind of feel that Ludovic Kennedy maybe overreached slightly in his portrayal of Tim Evans. As the mind of a child bit is the bit that really sticks with me. So if you view it as campaigning commission, can you analyse this? Because we think he didn't even say this stuff. We think it's a dodgy confession. I think that puts another layer of potential critique on top of the Jan Svartvik work. So I guess the bottom line question is, does, having now heard of us speak about this linguistic evidence, does it change your overall view of Evans's statements? You've said gingered up a bit rather than inserted. Is that where you're landing? And does that change any view for the wider case for you?
It is quite significant in that part of the problem people have always had in arguing for Evans' innocence is the detail of his confession. You know, the kind of specificity of what he did and how. If the sections that would deal with that are so unreliable, that makes it all the more likely that he's completely innocent. But I, nonetheless, still believe he was all mixed up in it. I think Christie murdered both Beryl and Geraldine, but I think that Evans felt himself deeply complicit. Christie told a lot of lies, they both did. But to the prison guard, on the point that he thought everything was lost and he'd been sentenced to death, he said that Tim Evans had told him to do Beryl in. And to me, this is maybe it was a drunken sort of bravura thing that Evans said, but the set of events he put in motion, with Christie first of all killing Beryl and then killing the baby to cover up that crime, I think that Evans may well have been very understandably confused about his moral responsibility. And if Derek Bentley was hanged for shouting out let him have it to his accomplice, surely Tim Evans might have been hanged for saying "do a rear" to his downstairs neighbour. So I think that if the statements Tim Evans made, Notting Hill Police, are shaky, that's just, if anything, kind of confirms the fact that he didn't really have all the detail about how the murders took place, because he didn't do them.
Yeah.
But that he may well have been sort of trying to put himself in the frame, because at that point he thought that was the best way of dealing with things, to comply and let Christie help him out later, perhaps. But he felt guilty.
Yeah. You talk here about that guilt and how that's the feelings of guilt that he would have felt around what happened to Beryl and to Geraldine, and how this kind of possibly, now the statements, when we originally read them, and they seem to be completely contradictory, and we can't have any kind of explanation for how the story changes so much, but that actually, if you view it in the way that you've just described, it starts to make a little bit more sense, that he's gone to Merthyr Tydfil, turned himself in, and he says he's disposed of his wife, he's found her dead because of drugs that he'd given her, and then when he's told, actually, no, there's no body in the drain, which is what he'd kind of claimed there was, that's when he's decided to change his story and say, right, okay, well, we'll bring Christie we'll actually let him kind of shoulder some of the blame now, and introduces him into it. And then once he's back in Notting Hill, he finds out about the strangled bodies and Christie denying any involvement. There's then when he realises the abortion story can't actually account for Geraldine's death and only for Beryl's. So this is when we get this other change. So he tells the police that he had killed Beryl and Geraldine because he was in despair. He'd set it in motion, and so he would have felt the responsibility around that. So you talk as well towards the end, we're in this final chapter, which Tim had to keep his tightly...
I finished the book.
Finished way before I did, so it was must have been torturous that couple of days. But we've got this suggestion then, as you mentioned there, that we've got this confession from Christie that was to a prison guard. But he then retracted it, didn't he? So
Yes.
At some point later. So, and why was that? Because it's an interesting explanation behind that.
So Christie made the confession to the prison guards straight after his sentencing, and he was 2 weeks away from being hanged for murder. And it's leaked into the papers somehow that he had maybe confessed to murdering the child. But when his solicitors asked him about it, he denied it completely. And I think this is because by then he had learned that there was a plea for mercy. There was another chance that he would be saved from the gallows. And to admit to killing the child really would have cost him something, whereas a couple of days earlier he thought he had nothing to lose. So he retracted it. And it just was chalked up as yet another of his reversals and attention-grabbing devices. And when I first saw this memo, I must say, I sort of thought that too. I thought, oh, God, not another, yeah. But because of the thing he said about Tim Evans asking him to do her in, that sort of stayed with me. And the more I thought about it, the more it was like, this is like Strangers on a Train by Patricia Highsmith, where one man feels complicit in a murder that he has not exactly commissioned, but that kind of,
These days that'd be captured as joint enterprise, for which all sorts of people are convicted for much less than that.
Right.
Yeah.
And Christie apparently had no motive for killing either Beryl or Geraldine, and Tim Evans would have known that, not knowing that he was a serial killer.
Yes.
And so it seemed hopeless to accuse his downstairs neighbour of being the murderer of his family. So that it sort of made it helped. It gave me some relief in these very contradictory stories. Here was a way of understanding why Tim Evans kept lying.
I think that's interesting. So for I think my interpretation is quite close to what you've just said. I think that in terms of the statements themselves, I think that the second Merthyr Tydfil statement is probably the closest to the truth. And I think that at that point, possibly Tim Evans doesn't know that Geraldine is dead. He believes Christie has got the baby looked after somewhere. And he's saying that it's all to do with Christie as an abortionist. That's the statement where Christie is introduced as a potential abortionist, and that guilt of getting it going. And I think for me that he only discovers the baby's death back in Notting Hill.
I
It's
think
one
so,
story. Yeah.
And then when he discovers the baby's death, the despair he feels would be the despair he feels because he would feel, oh, of course.
Yeah.
And I did this.
Yes.
You know,
And guilty of something,
Yeah.
and not the thing that,
not the
not the
literal
not the
murder.
literal murder. So one of the things that in the discussion that we had at the end was about how the Criminal Cases Review Commission didn't recommend that there was a referral to the Court of Appeal and a retrial, which would actually have led to the conviction being quashed, and that Evans's surviving relative had campaigned for the conviction to actually be quashed rather than merely pardoned. I was wondering whether that's something that you see that distinction as being important, or would see it as being important for the family?
I think it probably was important for the family. I think it probably was disappointing that Evans didn't have the conviction overturned. But I think that the court made it clear that they did think he was innocent. It was just a question of the resources, the expense of proving something that was already widely accepted. First of all, there was Ludovic Kennedy's book in 1961 arguing for Tim Evans' innocence, which was a bestseller. Then there was the film in 1971, which very much the narrative was that Evans had been framed and set up by Christie. Recent BBC drama, same narrative. So it is the established narrative, is that Evans was innocent and that he was manipulated. It's almost sort of immaterial.
Yes.
It's whether the conviction is quashed or overturned or whatever. I mean, it's not immaterial.
No, it's
for the family, but culturally, that is what we've got. Is that Christie done it? I think that is the received wisdom on this.
I agree. It's the received wisdom. It's whether you need that on top. It's a very interesting place, perhaps, to end.
Yeah. So thank you so much for coming in. It's an absolutely fascinating discussion.
Thank you very much for being our guest.
Thank you very much for having me. It's been very interesting.
Of course, The Peepshow, The Murders at 10 Rillington Place, comes with our wholehearted recommendation. It's a great read.
Yes, I thoroughly enjoyed it, and I literally read it overnight, thereby beating Nicci to the end. If you've read The Peepshow and have a comment, or if you've got a question about anything in this or our other episodes, please remember you can get in touch with the show via our email, writingwrongs, WRITINGWRONGS, at aston, aston.ac.uk. We'll pick up your questions in an end-of-season question and answer episode.
If you've been affected by any of the themes in this week's episode, please consider contacting the resources in the episode description.
This has been Writing Wrongs, an original podcast from the Aston Institute for Forensic Linguistics at Aston University. We'll see you next time. Goodbye.
Goodbye.